Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin. My name is Todd Pruitt, and I am the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City College way out in western Pennsylvania. Carl, good to see you. I'm
Good
glad
to see
you
you
were
too,
able
Todd.
to join us today, the man of the world. Where have you just been most recently?
Well, the weekend I was in Canada. I spoke at a religious freedom conference in Canada.
Now,
And
Canada's about to be the 51st state.
I believe we're about to buy it, yeah. So
Yeah.
we need some way to get to Greenland, which is going to be the 52nd state.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's,
I can't wait to visit Greenland.
yeah, it was fun. I was encouraged actually I spoke to staffers at Parliament. There are a lot of young people involved in these who really get what's going on. So I was actually very encouraged by it. And on the way home, I was recognized in Dulles Airport. Somebody came up to me and said, you one of those guys on Mortification of
Oh,
Spin?"
goodness.
So
I'm just impressed they didn't think you were Lex Luthor.
no, they asked if I could get your autograph, which was a slight insult. But
let me know. I've got the 8x10 glossies ready. I'll send them out your way.
Yes,
All right.
But who have we got on today?
Well, I'm really delighted that our guest today has agreed to risk her reputation and be on Mortification of Spin. Several weeks back, I got a text from somebody who said there was this new book I needed to check out. And the title of it is "We Shall All Be Changed: How Facing Death with Loved Ones Transforms Us." The author, Whitney Pipkin, is a journalist who lives in Northern Virginia. Carl and I both have adult children who live out in that part of the world. And I got the book, I began reading it and was immediately hooked. First of all, the subject matter is important to me. As a pastor, I have to deal with issues of death. I get asked questions. I deal with people who are grieving, who have experienced loss. And so the subject matter hooked me immediately. And as I began to read it, I was really moved and helped by it, and began to get copies of it in the hands of some of the church members that I serve, who have reported back that they've been really encouraged and blessed. And a few of these folks have experienced some very significant loss in the last few years. And so I've been very pleased at the reception it's received. And anybody who's served in pastoral ministry or is an elder and has to minister with people is always thankful to get really good books in their hands on really important subject matters. And I'm happy to report that this is another one, folks, that you can really be helped by. But our guest today is the author, Whitney Pipkin. Whitney, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, this is a difficult subject. It's a necessary subject. It's a subject that is, as you point out in the book, it's around us all the time. We just oftentimes don't talk about it much. So what was the impetus for you to delve into this difficult area, dealing with death of a loved one?
Yeah. I think what's funny is I say in the book that I'm an unlikely person to write this, because I was the one kind of avoiding this topic our whole lives, between my sister and I. My mom was diagnosed with cancer when I was in middle school and we were young, and she had it almost as a chronic disease for 20 years, and she died in 2020. And for many of those years, I wanted to avoid this topic. I was getting married, having kids. I had each of my 3 kids during that time, and there was just a lot going on, and it was something I really would rather not have dealt with. And yet, after she died, I found that this thing that I had been running from, this shadow of death, was actually a place that God was inviting me to know Him in a deeper way. That what He says in Psalm 23 is true, that He will be with us in the valley of the shadow of death. And so there was an intimacy with the person of Christ, the man of sorrows, there, that I found that I really feel like many of the people before now knew this, right? Like there would have been births and deaths in the living room. But now I felt this kind of aha about this. This is a place God wants to teach us and to train us to live better toward our own deaths. And so I just felt a sense of urgency around understanding this theology of death and explaining it through my own story.
You
You
hinted at
mentioned,
there the reality that earlier generations had to deal with death in ways far more familiar than we do. What is it about our day and our time and our culture that makes it possible, so possible for us to avoid the
Mhm.
subject?
Yeah, it's interesting because we think like each generation is going to live longer than the one before because we have science and we have advancements. In my own story, my great grandmother lived to 100, and my grandmother lived less. My mom lived less than that. So it's actually the opposite, which is not necessarily prophetic, but it's not always true. But I think that is kind of the age that we're in is one of our own immortality, or at least a chasing of it and an avoiding of mortality as long as possible. Because really it has nothing to teach you. There's not, but when you're a Christian, you see that death has much to teach us. I came to this topic actually even before my mom died through Psalm 90 and teaching on that at a retreat. And Moses has been told, you're not going to make it to the promised land, and he is writing in light of the boundary lines that have been drawn around his own life. And he's saying, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And he ends with, therefore establish the work of our hands. So he doesn't, wallow in despair and go back to bed, but he sees that these boundary lines are to teach us how to live well. So it has something really important to teach the Christian, that we wouldn't have had to work so hard to learn had we been in that quintessential one-room schoolhouse, or one-room living situation with your grandmother and your babies all being like birth and death in the same room. Whereas now we have the option of having it happen away, out of sight. We have professionals that can handle it, and we don't have to take that invitation to be near to those who are dying.
Yeah.
yeah, and we've also developed ways of keeping the dead at a distance even after they've died. I was actually just this morning teaching a class, and I mentioned to the students how different the experience of worship would be if you were having to walk past the graves of
Yeah.
your ancestors, maybe your spouse, your parents, possibly even your children, of course, in an earlier era
Mhm.
of high infant mortality. That would make the experience of Sunday worship a very, very different thing. And think of the early church, where the early church would gather to have meals in sort of gravesites.
Mhm.
So the dead were a presence among the living in a way that we don't have now. Well, one thing that intrigued me, you mentioned there that you yourself were very young when your mother received what was ultimately her death sentence, I suppose.
Mhm.
My own father died of cancer, but I was touching middle age by the time my father received his terminal diagnosis. And you mentioned that you had your own kids and you'd walk through this with your own kids. What would you say to parents of children? How do you introduce the idea of death to young children? We know that very small children can't think
Mm.
conceptually and abstractly, so there's not a lot of point in talking to a 2.5-year-old about death. But 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, how do you start introducing the topic to them in a way that doesn't unnecessarily scare them,
Mhm.
but actually does make them understand something of the truth of the human condition?
Yeah. Well, so my kids are 10, 7, and 4 right now. So I'm still, we'll see if I've done this right. The jury is still out on, but my husband and I have taken a honesty is the best policy. We trust that what Scripture says is sufficient, and we uh, tell them we don't know about the things that it doesn't speak to. So, the first loss is often an animal, a dog. Um, my kids' first loss was their grandmother, but shortly after we lost a dog. And they talk about those in the same breath. Poor grandma. The year we lost grandma and Ariel. Like they're
Yeah.
together. So to kids, there's just this, okay, they were here and now they're not here. And that's as much as they can kind of understand. But I think there was a moment I remember I had to choose whether I was going to try to protect them from the fullness of how it was affecting me. And I was struggling to parent. I really wanted to be like happy mom and have it together. And it was all the togetherness that didn't work when I was grieving. And I remember my husband saying, "What are you so afraid of? Why don't you just let them in and see what happens?" And so I did. I told them when I was sad and why I was crying, because that was actually better than snapping at them because I was craving space and not getting it. And once I invited them in, the way that just grew empathy in them, which I wasn't even trying to do. But they may not know, okay, grandma's not here anymore, but they could see, and our mom is very sad. And she's sad in a way that she's not when grandma just leaves from a trip. So it helped them distinguish between kind of the types of loss, and the layers of it. And I remember my son was 3, and he came in one time, and I have this picture, of my mom, on my desk, whatever. And he came in, and it just dawned on him, like, that was your mom. So you don't have a mom now. You don't have a mom here. And he was genuinely sad and genuinely comforting to me. So I don't know, they really can get more than we think they can get. They're capable of a lot more. But also one of the unique things about grieving when you have young kids is they don't let you stay sad very long. They're like, and I'm hungry, or they start tickling you or something awkward. They bounce back to joy so naturally, so easily. And it reminded me that I can do that too. That invitation is there for me too. I can be both very sad and joyful. I mean, the Christian message contains both. We have Easter weekend, we have it all right there. And so we have permission to follow our kids into the hard places and also follow them back out.
One of the things that I appreciate about the denomination I'm part of is that it's in our book of church order that funerals are worship services of the church, and so funerals are conducted in a particular way. But one of the things that frustrates me about a pastor these days is that I almost never see kids at funerals.
Yeah.
Parents leave their kids at home, and not that you have to bring them to every single funeral, but I never see kids at our funerals. When I was a kid, you know, when my mom and dad would go to funerals, I went with them. I went with them to all the weddings because they made me. I went with them to all. I didn't understand it at the time, the value in that, but I came to learn the value of that. At a young age, I was learning to process death, and I can still remember as a 10 or 11-year-old attending a funeral of a 6 or 7-year-old boy in our church,
Hmm.
and I still see it there.
Hmm.
I can still remember that, and I'm sad that a lot of Christian kids today are not getting those those important introductions from in the midst of Christian instruction,
Hmm.
um, to that. How do we encourage
Yeah.
without being morbid, but to say, moms and dads, we've got a funeral this weekend. Think about bringing your kids to that.
Yeah. Yeah, we were reflecting on, I mean, your kids are in the Northern Virginia area. We had this horrible plane crash that happened
Mhm.
recently, and I'm from Wichita, so it affected me just wondering if I would know somebody. You're from Wichita.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I pastored there for 9.5 years. It's where my
Okay.
kids call home. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just is jarring, and it was affecting me. I'm like, this is annoying. I don't actually know anybody yet on this plane, but so then we talk about it. We talk about it with our kids. And then we were talking about, as this testimonies came out about people who were on that plane that were people of faith, that was what people talked about them was their faith. Just noting like
Mm.
what an opportunity, and praying for those funerals, that they would be, as powerful as I found the articles, just that they would be a testimony, about that this is coming for each of us. How then shall we live? I mean, this is the
Yeah.
question that each of us has the opportunity to consider at a funeral, but also when we read the news and when loss is far away, and when it's close, really close
Mm.
to home.
One thing I really appreciate as well about your approach, Whitney, is you're very honest about the need for mourning. Um, I'm very struck. It was I didn't notice this. It was actually Rusty Reno pointed this out to me a couple of years ago. The first reference to weeping in the Bible occurs in Genesis 23 verse 2. which reads, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And it strikes me very striking that the first mention of weeping is relative to death, but just as significant is the person who weeps.
Mm-hmm.
It's Abraham who has the promise.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham, who in some ways, more than anybody else on the face of the earth at that point, has reason for hope. And still it is legitimate for him to weep for the loss of a loved one. Have you come across, I've come across this, and I wonder if you have and how you've handled it, come across Christians who seem to feel guilty about mourning the death of a loved one. And you just want to say to them, it is okay. You've been reduced by the death of your father, your mother, your spouse, your child. You shouldn't feel guilty. That's one burden you shouldn't bear, feeling guilty about mourning for them.
Yeah. I mean, I feel this. When you write a book on this topic, people are like, are you okay? Like you've said a lot about like, are you doing okay? And I'm like, well, partly because I wrote a book about it. So I'm going to be posting things like that for a while, even if I don't feel that way that day. But also, it's not that I'm not okay. This is an okay thing to be processing. This happened. And I think we often are just so uncomfortable with other people's grief. That's often why we say the wrong things and we just do weird things. Job's friends were good friends for the first 7 days when they were quiet and sitting with him, and then they opened their mouths and it was downhill from there. But we see this, like, Christians are uncomfortable with it, but we see that Christ was obviously not. I love that in John 11 also, when Jesus arrives, and if anyone had a reason to not cry, he was about to resurrect Lazarus. I mean, he was about to bring him back to life. And yet the shortest verse in the Bible tells us that Jesus paused to weep. And these sisters who are in such a hurry to get him to come here, heal him, we know you can. He gets there and he still stops and cries over the loss of his friend, over the existence of death at all. And if that isn't an invitation to do the same, even and especially for Christians who know that if our loved ones trusted in Christ, that's one of the main reasons someone would talk you out of grieving is, well, they're in a better place. But that they're not here, and I'm not with them. And death is still an affront to our original makeup as human beings created in the image of God. So it's still worth weeping over and grieving over fully, whatever that looks like. I can't give timelines, but I will say it's never convenient, but it is always something to listen to and attend to, because it can also teach you about your humanity and the ways that Jesus in his humanity also express these same emotions, and they're worthy emotions.
Yeah. One of the things I inevitably will talk to a lot of people about when a loved one dies is the subject of regret over things that weren't said, regret over things that were not settled. I've struggled with the same thing when my dad died about almost 7 years ago. I remember being in the hospital room with him and having a hard time moving as close to him as I should have, because there were some things I'd held on to, some things that needed to be said that weren't said, talked about that weren't talked about. And when he died, I'd never bridged those things, and I felt overwhelming regret. And and since then, I've gotten lots of feedback from other Christians who have that same kind of experience. And, I wonder well, part of it is right out of the passage where you get the title of your book, but what is the ultimate, where do we point these people where, they say, okay, it's too late. This person's gone now. I can't say these things now. I can't seek reconciliation in this area. How do we comfort them in that regret? What's the answer to that regret?
Hmm. Ooh, I am kind of like a regret averse person. I don't tend to have it. Maybe because I come from a family where we talked about all of it and then, said we were sorry later. Maybe the opposite end. And my husband
Yeah.
is more probably, why don't you guys talk about it? Like, why aren't we talking about this kind of situation? So, I I think I feel that sense of regret come up, and I don't want to go there maybe, so I push back against it. But I think that we want so badly to be in charge of and in control of the stories that are unfolding around our relationships and our loved ones, that this is part of receiving the story that God has for you with your loved one. And sin affects not just their life by shortening it, but it affects that relationship. And so those are also things to be grieved, that the relationship wasn't what it could
Right.
have been.
Right.
I mean, that was an aspect of my story was, my mom had cancer all these years, and it changed her, and it made it really hard to be her daughter sometimes because the whole thing was about her. And people who have chronic illness, that's a thing and that happens for a lot of people, is it's really hard to be the caregiver for a long time.
Right.
It changes the dynamic in ways that are regrettable. And so that's another layer to take to the Lord and to grieve. In God's kindness, He provided somebody to say, why don't you talk to her about that now? A month before she died, and I was able to experience some healing in those
That's good.
areas. So that some of that stirring is, something to respond to, and some of it
Yeah.
is something to
That's
grieve because you can't fix.
right. Because you can't fix it all. Yeah.
No,
And that's really helpful. I was a mutual friend that Carl and I have, who's also a pastor, and I was on a road trip with him, and I was talking to him about these very things. This was not long after my dad had died, and we had a lot of time to talk. So I just said, man, I'm really struggling with regret here. Like, it's grieving me because I didn't talk about this, and I didn't say this, and I didn't make this thing right, or I didn't try to offer, hey, how can we make this right? And I said, and I was just saying, I can't make it right now. It's too late. I can't do anything. And he very wisely said some of the exact same things you said about the reality of grief. This is a fallen world. But then he said, but Todd, ultimately, the resurrection. Remember the
Mm,
resurrection.
yeah,
God's going to make it right. Your dad was a
mm,
believer. There's going to be a reunion. There will, these things will be made right. And there was such a comfort in that. That really helped me. And again, it goes to the title of your book, right? 1 Corinthians 15. Without 1 Corinthians 15, we are to be pitied above all
yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, I love there's a lyric in a Grey Haven song that says, it's like somebody reuniting at the resurrection. It says, I always knew you could be like this. I saw glimpses of it before. And I love that. There's aspects of our loved ones that we know they aren't the fullest version of themselves, just like we aren't the fullest version of ourselves. There are sins that just dog us our whole lives, and we can't quite be the person we want to be in that relationship. So I look forward to that moment of, man, I
Yeah.
always knew that mother-daughter could be this sweet because we weren't dogged by our own sins. And so that loss is a stirring of our affections for the dawn of resurrection. So that's the double-sidedness of loss. It's not a silver lining. It's double-sided in that we grieve, therefore we remember that our hope is not wrapped up in this world, but is in longing for the next.
Yeah, I think it was, and Carl, you could correct me, but I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, I'm paraphrasing, um, the reason why everybody longs for a better world is because we were made for that better world. And whether you're talking about sophisticated people or primitive people, ancient people or contemporary people, everybody longs for, because it's written on our hearts to need that and to long for that. And that's why passages about the resurrection, passages about the new creation, 1 Corinthians 15, Revelation 20 and 21, provide such fuel for the hope of God's people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As we're sort of drawing to a close here, Whitney, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, and that is, I'm sure there are people listening to the podcast for whom the death of a loved one is not, okay, we're all going to lose a loved one some hypothetical point in the future, but there are probably people listening to the podcast who know that in the next month, 6 months, a parent, a spouse, maybe most tragically of all, a child is going to die. What's the one thing that you would press upon those people as they face this sort of the hour of crisis?
That the places you are most afraid to go, feel most ill-equipped to venture to, whether that's the bedside or the morning after are the places Christ has gone before you, will go with you, will not abandon you. I think grief is particularly lonely because even if you experience that loss, my sister and I both lost our mom, but we had very different experiences, very different moments and days. And there were so many moments where Christ was the only one who could really understand what I was going through and whose own experience wasn't in the way of being there for me. We can only do so much for one another. But this is where like the rubber meets the road. I mean, this is where knowing and being in Christ, having union with Christ really matters because I don't know, I have these like visual moments of just feeling so in the pit and dark, and I couldn't get myself out of it, right? Like I was just so grieved and I couldn't produce, and I valued myself for my ability to produce. And it was in that moment that it mattered whether I believed the finished work of Christ was enough. Did I believe it was enough for my mom when she was still not ready to go? And I spoke that to her. Christ's work is finished, and that's what matters. Did I believe it for myself when I was grieving and couldn't get up and be super mom? Christ's work was enough, and it's what matters now. So whatever I would say, show up for the hard places because it is where Christ is and where we want to be as believers is in his presence. And whatever it comes, he is enough and he is with you.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much for that. And captures beautifully, of course, a lot of New Testament teaching and perhaps nothing more than Hebrews, where we're told that we have a great high priest who's been tested in every way, including death, of course, tested by the death of his own loved ones and then tested by his own death. We need to remember Christ was in the grave for 3 days. He himself experienced the full impact of death. So thank you so much for that, Whitney. And thank you for writing this book. It's beautifully written. I think it will be very, very helpful to a lot of people. For those of you listening, it is Whitney K. Pipkin. We Shall All Be Changed, How Facing Death with Loved Ones Transforms Us. And it's available from Moody Publishers. And if you're listening and go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter for a chance to win a copy of this book. If you don't win the copy, though, please don't let that stop you from getting hold of a copy, reading it and passing it on to friends who may be facing these struggles and challenges, as we all will at certain points in our lives. While you're visiting our website, please do consider making a donation. We are a listener-supported podcast. We're always grateful for donations that help us continue to produce the program. Other than that, all that remains is for me to thank you for joining us, to thank our guest, Whitney, for being with us, and to ask you, hope that you will join us again in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.